Welcome to my channel. Today, we relive one of the most haunting days in American aviation history. A tragedy that began under the calm blue skies of San Diego and ended in fire, chaos, and heartbreak. It's a story of two planes, one sky, and a chain of moments that would forever change the rules of flight. On a warm Sunday morning, September 25, 1978, San Diego was glowing in golden sunlight. Families were heading to church. The hum of lawnmowers drifted through quiet neighborhoods, and children played in their backyards beneath the calm roar of jet engines passing high above. To everyone on the ground, it felt like an ordinary day. But in the skies above, two aircraft were on a collision course that no one had yet seen coming. Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182, a Boeing 727 packed with passengers returning home, and a small private Cessna 172 flown by two men on a routine training mission. Two flight paths about to cross in one tragic instant. The morning had begun routinely at Lindbergh Field, where PSA Flight 182 prepared for takeoff. Inside the cockpit, Captain James McFerrin greeted his crew with the casual calm of experience. He had flown this route countless times. His first officer, Robert Fox, and flight engineer Martin Wan were equally confident. Behind them, 78 passengers filled the cabin, business travelers, students, and families heading home after the weekend. At 8:59 a.m., the 727 lifted off the runway, climbing into the clear morning sky. The air traffic controllers at San Diego's Montgomery Field watched as the jet ascended, their screens showing the usual patterns of local flights weaving through civilian and training airspace. Among them was the small Cessna, piloted by instructor Martin Kaze and student pilot David Boswell, navigating a visual approach lesson through the same corridor. They were cleared to operate in controlled airspace under the watchful eye of the tower, but in an era before digital collision avoidance systems, the skies relied on coordination and trust that every pilot and controller could see and understand each other's position perfectly. As the two aircraft climbed and descended, their paths began to converge, slowly, invisibly, and fatally. Inside PSA Flight 182's cockpit, the crew chatted easily, unaware of the danger forming beyond their windshield. They had been told about the Cessna below them but believed they had it in sight. "Traffic's at 12 o'clock, one voice said. "Yeah, we've got him," another confirmed. But they didn't. The Cessna had slipped into a blind spot beneath the 727's nose, invisible from the cockpit. In the control tower, a controller double-checked the radar, believing the jet's crew still had visual contact. "Maintain visual separation," he said. That phrase, routine, simple, became the hinge on which fate would turn. Both crews, both aircraft, and an entire city below were now depending on a handful of seconds, a patch of blue sky, and a single human assumption. At 9:01 a.m., PSA Flight 182 banked slightly right, descending through 2,600 feet. The Cessna, just below, turned left, climbing gently. Their paths crossed directly above the North Park neighborhood. In the cockpit of the 727, one of the pilots noticed something, a flicker of movement, a flash of white against the sun. "Oh, I've got that other 12 o'clock, he said, voice suddenly tight. Another voice followed, uncertain. "Where's he at now?" Silence, then panic. "I think he's passed off to our right." And then, in the next second, "Oh God, we're going to hit it." The collision was instantaneous. The Boeing's right wing sliced through the smaller plane, tearing it apart in midair. The impact shattered the 727's fuel tanks, and the sky exploded into fire. Witnesses on the ground saw a ball of flame bloom overhead, followed by a rain of burning debris that streaked through the morning sun. Inside Flight 182, chaos reigned. The cabin filled with smoke, alarms blared, and the aircraft began to break apart as it plunged earthward. On the radio, the final transmission came through. Captain McFerrin's voice, desperate and raw. "We're going down, baby. This is it." Moments later, the jet struck the ground at nearly 300 miles per hour, erupting into a fireball that consumed entire city blocks. Houses vanished beneath the inferno, cars melted in the streets, and the sky filled with black smoke visible for miles. When firefighters arrived, there was little left to save. The neighborhood had become a landscape of ash and twisted metal. The remains of both planes lay scattered across North Park, a suburban street transformed into a crater of sorrow. As investigators combed through the wreckage in the days that followed, the air still reeked of jet fuel and burnt wood. The human cost was staggering: 135 lives lost, including everyone aboard both planes and several residents on the ground. Survivors from nearby homes described the horror in haunting detail. The roar overhead, the flash of light, the heat that scorched their faces before they could run. One firefighter later said, "It was like the sun fell on the city." The National Transportation Safety Board faced immense pressure to find out how such a disaster could happen under clear skies. The black box recordings painted a devastating picture: miscommunication, momentary confusion, and a tragic misjudgment. The crew of Flight 182 had believed they saw the Cessna, but they were looking at the wrong aircraft. The controller, trusting their confirmation, gave no further warning. And in the end, technology that could have prevented the accident simply didn't exist yet. In the months after, the disaster forced aviation to confront its vulnerabilities. Public outrage led to sweeping changes in flight control procedures, collision avoidance protocols, and radar tracking standards. It was the wake-up call that birthed modern traffic alert and collision avoidance systems, the very technology that now prevents mid-air crashes around the world. For San Diego, the memory remained deeply personal. The neighborhood of North Park rebuilt, but scars lingered. A memorial was erected, small but powerful, standing as a reminder of that quiet Sunday when ordinary people became part of an extraordinary tragedy. Survivors and rescuers still gather there each year, their silence heavier than any words. And for those who study aviation safety, this disaster endures as one of the most pivotal lessons in flight history. A moment when human error collided with human limitation, teaching the world that even in a sky so vast, one oversight can change everything. The voices on the radio from that morning still echo through training simulators and classrooms. Calm at first, then confusion, then the heartbreak of realization. It reminds pilots and controllers alike that vigilance, communication, and technology must work together, always. Because as the story of San Diego proved, a clear day can hide the deadliest storm. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here, we honor the stories written in the skies, the courage, the tragedy, and the lessons that keep every flight safe today. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may your skies always stay clear. The day after the disaster, San Diego awoke under a sky that no longer felt like its own. The air smelled of smoke and jet fuel, and the once bustling streets of North Park had fallen silent, broken only by the sound of emergency sirens and the hum of helicopters circling overhead. The wreckage stretched for blocks. Twisted metal fused with the remnants of homes, burned-out cars, and fragments of lives that had been reduced to ash in seconds. Firefighters worked tirelessly through the night, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. Many were veterans of wildfires and car crashes, but nothing had prepared them for this. The sight of a passenger jet scattered through a neighborhood like confetti from hell. Reporters from across the nation poured in, cameras rolling as investigators marked debris with bright flags, each one representing a clue in a story too painful to tell. The headline flashed across every screen and newspaper by morning: 2 planes, 1 sky, San Diego's worst air disaster. But behind the headlines were families searching for loved ones, people clutching photographs, praying for miracles that would never come. At the crash site, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board moved carefully among the ruins, cataloging every fragment they could recover. The heat from the fires had melted aluminum into pools that hardened like wax, and the smell of burning plastic and soil lingered for days. The voice recorder from the Boeing 727 was found partially buried under rubble near a destroyed house. When they played it back later in Washington, the sound that filled the room was not mechanical failure or storm interference. It was conversation, laughter, and then confusion. The crew of Flight 182 had been calm moments before the impact, unaware of the fatal convergence forming beneath them. The Cessna's small radar signature had blended into the clutter of the city below, invisible until it was too late. Investigators could hear the crew trying to locate the traffic, their voices uncertain but still composed. "I think he's off to our right," one said. Then came the fateful seconds, the shout, the impact, the chaos. The final words, "We're going down, baby," left even hardened investigators silent. One technician removed his headphones and said quietly, "They never had a chance." Meanwhile, the people of San Diego were left to make sense of what they had witnessed. Survivors from the neighborhood described the explosion as a sound that split the world in two. Windows shattered miles away. One man, still shaking, told a reporter, "I looked up and saw a fireball falling. Then everything went red." Another, a mother who had been hanging laundry in her backyard, said she felt the heat before she heard the crash. The shockwave threw her to the ground as pieces of burning debris rained down. For hours, the sky glowed with the reflection of the fires below, and the streets filled with first responders working against impossible odds. The police had to form human chains to keep onlookers back, their faces pale as they realized what lay beyond the yellow tape. Ambulances lined the streets, not to transport survivors, but to carry the lost. By nightfall, a makeshift command center had been established at a nearby church, where rescuers, priests, and government officials gathered. The pews became beds for the exhausted, and the air buzzed with the steady hum of radios crackling with updates no one wanted to hear. For the families of the passengers aboard PSA Flight 182, the hours stretched into endless waiting. At the airport, loved ones stood near the arrival gate, faces turned toward the door that would never open. Airline representatives spoke in hushed tones, reading names from manifests and confirming the unthinkable. One woman collapsed into her husband's arms when she heard her brother's name. Another, a young man in a flight jacket, stared blankly at the PSA logo, whispering, "It could have been me." Inside the terminal, an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant sobs of those receiving the worst news of their lives. Outside, reporters swarmed the scene, their microphones trembling in their hands as they described the scale of the tragedy. "It looks like a war zone," one anchor said live on air. "Entire homes have vanished. It's hard to believe this was a neighborhood just yesterday." As the investigation deepened, attention turned to the control towers at San Diego's Lindbergh Field and Montgomery Field. The transcripts of communication between the tower and both aircraft became the focal point of national scrutiny. It revealed that PSA Flight 182 had been warned about the Cessna below, instructed to maintain visual separation. "We have the traffic in sight," the pilots had said, confident and professional, but radar tracking showed that they never truly saw the smaller plane. When investigators replayed the radar sequence frame by frame, they realized the two flight paths had intersected with chilling precision, two blips becoming one, then disappearing completely. The human mind struggled to comprehend how two pilots could miss each other in a sky so clear. "It wasn't visibility," one investigator said. "It was assumption. They thought they knew where the other was." The tragedy struck a raw nerve across the aviation community. Airlines across the country began reviewing their procedures, realizing that visual confirmation alone was no longer enough to guarantee safety in busy skies. Pilots spoke openly about the pressures of maintaining situational awareness while juggling multiple tasks. Controllers admitted that even the best eyes couldn't track everything in a crowded airspace. For many, this disaster wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning written in fire across the sky. But while the industry debated responsibility, the people of North Park mourned. Funerals filled churches for weeks. Flags flew at half-mast. Streets once alive with laughter became places of quiet remembrance. Some residents moved away, unable to bear the sight of the place where the planes had fallen. Others stayed, tending to small memorials on corners where their loved ones had died. And through it all, one question echoed louder than any other. How could this have happened on a clear, perfect day with experienced pilots, functioning equipment, and no sign of trouble? The answer, the investigators knew, would not lie in mechanical failure or malice, but in something far more human. It would take months to uncover the chain of errors, the tiny assumptions and split-second decisions that had sealed the fate of everyone aboard those planes. But even before the final report, one truth was clear. The sky above San Diego would never be the same. Every takeoff, every landing, every pilot's glance out the window would carry the memory of that September morning when two planes shared the same sky. And no one lived to tell the story as weeks turned into months. The investigation into the San Diego mid-air disaster became one of the most extensive in aviation history. The NTSB team, a mix of engineers, pilots, and safety analysts, worked day and night to reconstruct the final moments before the collision. Every scrap of metal, every twisted bolt, every melted instrument was catalogued and examined. They built a full-scale simulation of both flights, Flight 182 and the Cessna 172, to determine how two aircraft could have collided in clear daylight. The findings were painstakingly slow to emerge, each revelation bringing more heartbreak than relief. There had been no malfunction, no sudden failure, no storm or turbulence. It was human perception that failed. The pilots of Flight 182 had seen a plane, but it wasn't the Cessna. They had misidentified another aircraft far below them and assumed the danger had passed. In the tower, controllers relied on the crew's confirmation and turned their attention to other traffic, unaware that both aircraft were still on a collision course. In those brief seconds, faith replaced vigilance, and that faith cost 144 lives. The public wanted someone to blame. Newspapers ran stories questioning the competence of the crew, the air traffic controllers, even the Federal Aviation Administration itself. Lawsuits began piling up before the fires in North Park had even cooled. PSA, once known for its friendly smile logo and cheerful service, became the center of outrage. The families of the victims gathered outside its headquarters, demanding accountability. Television crews followed every development, broadcasting images of investigators carrying blackened flight instruments from the crash site. "We trusted them to keep us safe," one grieving mother said into the microphone, her voice trembling. "Now my son's picture is all I have." In Washington, congressional hearings were called to address the growing public fury. Aviation officials sat beneath bright lights, answering hard questions from senators who demanded to know how two planes could meet in the same airspace without anyone realizing the danger. "It's a failure of coordination," one official admitted. "A failure of the system we built to prevent exactly this." In San Diego, the recovery continued quietly. The neighborhood of North Park, once a peaceful stretch of tree-lined streets, had become a place of uneasy reverence. Children no longer played near the intersection of Dwight and Nile Streets, where the 727 had struck the ground. The crater left by the impact had been filled in, but the smell of fuel still lingered on hot days. Local residents erected makeshift shrines, flowers, candles, photographs of strangers united by tragedy. Firefighters who had worked the scene struggled to forget what they had seen. Some quit their jobs, unable to face another call. Others spoke of nightmares that haunted them for years. "There was nothing left that looked human," one said quietly. "It wasn't like any disaster I'd seen. It was silence after the sound. And in that silence, an entire city tried to heal." Meanwhile, deep inside the NTSB's Washington headquarters, the final report was being drafted. It was a meticulous, clinical document, yet beneath its technical language lay the raw pulse of human fallibility. The board concluded that PSA Flight 182's crew had been notified of the Cessna's presence, acknowledged it, but then lost visual contact without informing the controller. The Cessna, under visual flight rules, was performing a routine training exercise and had climbed into the 727's flight path without realizing it. Both were operating under the assumption that the other would maintain separation. It was a chain reaction of trust gone wrong, a perfect storm of small, ordinary errors colliding into catastrophe. "There was no single mistake," the report read. "Only moments of human misjudgment that aligned in fatal harmony." The phrase struck every reader like a knife. Fatal harmony, two crews, two sets of eyes, two paths in one sky. When the findings were made public, they ignited both outrage and reform. The FAA, shaken by the magnitude of the disaster, fast-tracked new collision avoidance technology that had been languishing in development for years. For the first time, engineers began testing what would later become known as TAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, a radar-based safety network capable of detecting nearby aircraft and issuing automatic warnings to pilots. It would take nearly a decade for TCAS to be installed across commercial fleets, but its roots lay in that September morning over San Diego. The tragedy forced the world to confront a terrifying truth: that technology had to become the failsafe for human weakness. "The sky is no place for trust," one investigator said grimly. "It's a place for certainty." But technology couldn't mend the broken hearts left behind. Across California, families of the victims gathered for joint memorial services. Church bells tolled as hundreds of mourners filled pews, holding hands as names were read aloud. Among them were entire families who had died together, parents, children, grandparents, all on the same flight. Others were passengers who had changed their tickets at the last minute, fate placing them aboard the doomed plane. The ceremony at Greenwood Memorial Park was broadcast live, and when the final prayer ended, dozens of white doves were released into the air. They rose slowly into the sunlight, circling above the crowd before disappearing into the horizon. The sight was both beautiful and unbearable, a fragile image of peace over a city still grieving. For the pilots who continued to fly after the tragedy, the San Diego disaster became a haunting lesson whispered in every training simulator and cockpit briefing. Instructors would dim the lights, replaying the last radio transmissions of Flight 182. "I think he's passed off to our right," the pilot's voice would echo through the room. Then, the sudden gasp, the sound of impact and silence. It wasn't used to scare. It was used to remind. Every pilot who heard it understood what those words meant. How easily routine could turn into ruin, how quickly certainty could dissolve into chaos. In the years that followed, it became part of aviation's collective memory, an invisible scar carried by every captain who looked out the cockpit window and scanned the horizon for unseen danger. By the time the official investigation closed, the world had changed. San Diego rebuilt its homes, repaired its streets, and planted new trees where the fires had burned. But for those who lived through it, the shadow never truly faded. Survivors often spoke of how quiet the sky seemed afterward, as if even the planes themselves mourned. Every roar of an engine brought a flicker of memory, a reflexive glance upward, a silent prayer that it would keep flying true. For the city and for aviation itself, the crash of PSA Flight 182 became not just a tragedy but a turning point. A brutal reminder that progress is written in lessons carved from loss. And as the sun set over the Pacific each evening, the reflection of those skies told a story only the wind could carry. The story of two planes, one sky, and a moment that forever changed how humanity looked toward heaven. For in that one terrible instant, San Diego had paid the price for what the world would come to call the day the sky fell silent. The fourth phase of the investigation began not in San Diego, but in Washington, D.C., inside a conference room filled with charts, flight maps, and exhausted men and women who had stared at radar data for so long they could see it when they closed their eyes. Months had passed since the tragedy, but the questions still burned. Who was truly responsible? The pilots of Flight 182? The student and instructor aboard the Cessna? Or the air traffic controllers who had trusted what they heard, rather than what they saw on the radar? It was a question with no simple answer, and the deeper investigators dug, the more human the story became. Fragile, flawed, and tragically ordinary. Audio transcripts of the final minutes between both aircraft painted a chilling portrait of calm professionalism slowly eroding into confusion. The PSA crew had done what thousands of pilots did daily. They relied on visual contact, trusting their instincts, and the information given to them by the tower. The Cessna crew had followed every instruction perfectly, their voices steady, unaware that their path was guiding them directly into the shadow of the descending jet above. There was no recklessness, no negligence. Only two flights, each certain they were right, each believing the sky had enough room for both. When the NTSB reconstruction was complete, the findings were displayed on a large projection screen, a simulation that showed the two planes' paths converging with merciless precision. Watching it unfold in real time, the investigators felt the tension build, their eyes tracing the glowing lines that represented the doomed aircraft. "Right here," one of them said quietly, pointing to the screen. "This is the moment." The lines intersected, and the screen flashed red. A silence filled the room, No one spoke for several seconds. One of the senior investigators, a man who had seen countless air tragedies, rubbed his eyes and muttered, "They never saw each other. Not really." That became the foundation of the final report, an acknowledgement that sometimes tragedy does not come from failure, but from faith in a system built by imperfect hands. It was one of the most devastating conclusions in aviation history. No mechanical fault, no act of sabotage, no storm or malfunction, just human beings doing their best until their best wasn't enough. As the hearings continued, the families of the victims filled the courtroom galleries, holding framed photographs of the loved ones they'd lost. Some listened in silence, others wept openly. The sound of the cockpit recording was played aloud, the crew's final moments echoing through the chamber. Reporters described it as unbearable, a slow crescendo of normalcy giving way to terror. When the tape ended, you could have heard a pin drop. One mother stood and whispered, "They sounded so calm." And that was what haunted everyone most. The pilots of Flight 182 had not panicked, had not screamed. They had accepted, in their final second, that they were out of time. "We're going down, baby. This is it." The room remained still, as though no one dared breathe. Afterward, the NTSB director addressed the crowd, his voice heavy with empathy. "This accident was not about one man's error," he said. "It was about a system that failed to see what eyes could not." In the months that followed, the skies above San Diego began to fill again with aircraft, though the sound was different somehow. Muted, cautious, as if every pilot remembered. New regulations were implemented nationwide. Air traffic control procedures were rewritten, requiring constant radar monitoring of aircraft in shared airspace, even under visual conditions. Controllers were no longer allowed to rely solely on pilot confirmation when separation was uncertain. And most importantly, the Federal Aviation Administration accelerated the development of onboard collision avoidance systems. Engineers worked tirelessly, often referencing the PSA disaster by name in their reports. It became their mission, their obsession, to ensure that no two planes would ever again share the same sky without knowing it. Back in San Diego, life tried to return to normal. The neighborhood of North Park rebuilt slowly, though many who lived through that morning never truly recovered. Survivors spoke of how the crash had changed them, how the sound of engines overhead still made them stop what they were doing and look up. Children who had seen the fireball as they walked to school grew into adults who could never forget that image. One man, now older, told a journalist years later, "I was 16 when I saw it happen. Every time I hear a plane fly low, I still see that explosion." For the families, closure was harder to find. Lawsuits dragged on for years, with settlements that could never replace what was lost. Some turned their grief into activism, pushing for stronger aviation safety laws. Others simply couldn't bear to speak about it at all. Yet every year, on the anniversary, they gathered quietly at a small memorial near the crash site. Names etched in bronze gleamed in the sunlight, names of strangers bound together by one morning that changed everything. For PSA, the crash was an unhealable wound. The airline had long been a symbol of California's joy, its cheerful red and white jets famously painted with smiling faces on their noses. But after the disaster, that smile became a reminder of grief. Passengers were hesitant to fly with them again, and though the company worked tirelessly to restore public trust, the shadow of Flight 182 never lifted. By the mid-1980s, PSA was absorbed into another airline, its name quietly retired. Yet its legacy endured, not in branding or slogans, but in the countless safety measures born from its loss. Every pilot who sat in a simulator, every controller who tracked a radar screen, every engineer who calibrated a CAS sensor was, in some way, carrying the memory of those lost lives forward. The changes reached far beyond the United States. Aviation authorities around the world studied the San Diego disaster as a turning point in air traffic safety. The phrase "see and avoid" was no longer considered enough. Technology, not instinct, would now serve as the guardian of the skies. The International Civil Aviation Organization mandated new standards, ensuring that even in the busiest airspaces, every aircraft would be visible to every other. For the global aviation community, San Diego became a cautionary beacon, a painful reminder that progress is often written in the language of tragedy. And yet, for all the reforms, for all the advancements, the emotional scars endured. The controllers who had been on duty that morning never forgot the voices on their radios. Some left their posts, haunted by the knowledge that a single confirmation, "We have the traffic in sight," had sealed so many fates. Others stayed, determined to ensure it never happened again. Captain McFerrin, First Officer Fox, Flight Engineer Juan. Their names became part of aviation's unspoken history, spoken quietly by pilots in training when instructors reminded them why attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. By the first anniversary of the crash, the city had erected a small plaque in North Park. It read simply, "In memory of those who lost their lives on September 25, 1978. May their memory keep the skies safe." Every year since, families, pilots, and residents gather there in silence, flowers in hand, the distant sound of jets passing overhead. Some look up, others close their eyes. And as the breeze moves through the trees, one can almost imagine the faint echo of voices carried on the wind. Voices that once filled a cockpit above San Diego, unaware that their final moments would teach the world how fragile safety truly is. That is the lasting legacy of that terrible day. 2 planes, 1 sky, and a lesson the world will never forget. A lesson written not in metal or fire, but in the memory of every soul who looked to the heavens and understood how easily beauty can turn to tragedy when even the smallest moment of misunderstanding is allowed to grow. And though decades have passed, the people of San Diego still say that when the sky turns golden over North Park, it feels quieter somehow, as if the city itself still pauses to remember the morning when the sky fell and then, somehow, found the strength to rise again. Years after the flames had faded and the skies over San Diego returned to calm, the memory of that day still lingered like a scar no one could ignore. The investigation was over, the reports filed, and the safety reforms written into law, yet the weight of the tragedy lived on in the hearts of those who had survived it. Not only the residents of North Park, but also the men and women who had worked tirelessly to piece together what went wrong. In quiet offices, NTSB investigators still spoke of Flight 182 with a heaviness in their voices, because this wasn't just another case file or technical study. It was a wound that changed aviation forever. The wreckage had long been cleared, the streets rebuilt, the trees replanted. But for those who had been there, the echoes of that explosion had never stopped. One firefighter, years into retirement, would later tell a journalist, "You don't forget something like that. The sound, the smell, the silence afterward, it sticks with you. You can't unsee it." And he wasn't alone. The neighborhood that had once been full of laughter and Sunday morning routines now carried a quiet reverence, as if the ground itself remembered what had fallen from the sky. For the families of the victims, time did not erase grief. It simply reshaped it. Many had kept boxes of keepsakes, boarding passes, postcards, family photos from the day before the flight. Some carried small tokens, a wedding ring recovered from the wreckage, a scorched bracelet, a pilot's badge bent from heat. These fragments became symbols of remembrance and survival. Every September, they gathered at the memorial on Dwight Street, where engraved names gleamed under the California sun. Survivors would kneel beside the marker, running their fingers over the names and whispering things they wished they could have said before that fateful day. The local news would always cover the ceremony, the cameras capturing faces lined with time, but eyes still full of tears. Children who had been too young to understand now stood beside their aging parents, hearing for the first time the full story of what had happened that day, the day the sky betrayed their city. Meanwhile, in the world of aviation, the San Diego disaster had become a symbol, a warning that even perfection on paper could fail in practice. Pilot training evolved dramatically. Simulators were redesigned to include real-world collision scenarios, teaching crews how to react when visual contact was lost. Air traffic controllers began receiving deeper psychological training, learning to challenge and confirm even routine communications. No longer would a simple "we have the traffic in sight" be accepted without verification. The tragedy had rewritten the language of flight itself, transforming procedures born from trust into ones forged through precision. It was a painful evolution, but a necessary one. The Federal Aviation Administration began mandating the installation of TCAS, the traffic collision avoidance system, across commercial fleets. The system was revolutionary. It could detect other aircraft automatically and issue audible warnings before danger approached. If TCAS had existed in 1978, Flight 182 and the Cessna 172 would have never met. But progress always seems to trail behind tragedy, and in this case it took 144 lives to push humanity forward. Still, some critics argued that technology alone was not enough. Machines can warn us, one retired captain said during a conference years later. But they can't make us listen. His words struck a chord because the San Diego crash wasn't about the failure of equipment. It was about the failure of awareness. It was a mirror held up to the human side of aviation. The fatigue, the assumptions, the quiet overconfidence that sometimes comes with routine. The story of Flight 182 became a case study not just in safety but in humility. Pilots learned to respect the sky in a new way, to never take visibility for granted, to double-check even the simplest instruction. Air traffic controllers learned to question confirmations, to trust the radar over the voice, and to remember that one word can decide life or death. That shift in mindset became aviation's invisible memorial to those who had died. For the people of San Diego, healing came slowly. The rebuilt North Park neighborhood became a blend of new life and quiet remembrance. Families who moved into the area years later often spoke of an unspoken stillness that lingered there. "It's peaceful," one resident once said. "But sometimes, when planes pass low, the dogs start barking, and the air feels heavy, like the city remembers." And it did remember. Local schools began teaching about the crash in history classes, not to frighten children, but to honor the importance of safety and resilience. At a nearby park, a bronze sculpture depicting two hands reaching toward the sky was installed, symbolizing both loss and hope. Every year on the anniversary, flowers appear at its base, sometimes from family members, sometimes from strangers who never knew the victims but felt connected through the story. Among the most affected were the controllers who had worked that morning. Many of them never returned to duty. Some retired early. Others quietly transferred to different stations. One of them, years later, recorded an interview for a documentary, his voice shaking as he remembered the moment he lost both radar blips on his screen. "It was gone," he said softly. "One second they were there and the next second just gone. I still see it when I close my eyes." His confession brought to light the unseen victims of air disasters, the ones who survive but carry the guilt forever. The San Diego crash had broken more than metal and lives. It had fractured the faith people had in the idea that flight was safe simply because it was familiar. But from that fracture grew strength. The aviation community became more united than ever in preventing such a tragedy from happening again. Pilots from around the world studied the PSA case. Air traffic academies used it as a mandatory part of their curriculum. The phrases spoken in the cockpit that morning, "I think he's passed off to our right," "We're going down, baby," were repeated in classrooms not for shock, but for understanding. Those words were transformed from moments of horror into instruments of learning. Every pilot who trained after that day knew those voices, and every controller learned the story of how a moment's misjudgment had reshaped their profession. The disaster that once symbolized death had now become the foundation of modern aviation safety. Yet, for the city of San Diego, the wound never closed completely. Each year, as the anniversary approached, a stillness would descend over North Park. Residents would pause when they saw flowers being laid on street corners, or when they heard the faint sound of bagpipes from the memorial service. The city didn't just remember, it carried the story forward. "We live under the same sky they fell from," one resident said during the 40th anniversary. "The least we can do is never forget." And indeed, they never did. The story of PSA Flight 182 became a living reminder of what it costs to take safety for granted, of how fragile perfection can be, and how quickly the ordinary can become eternal. In the years that followed, as technology advanced and flight became safer than ever, one truth remained unchanged. The sky may belong to everyone, but it demands respect. And every time a jet lifted off from San Diego International Airport, climbing into that same stretch of blue where two planes once collided, the people watching from below couldn't help but glance up and whisper a silent prayer. The world may have moved on, but the city still remembered. Because in San Diego, The story of two planes and one sky wasn't just history. It was legacy. Decades passed, and the San Diego disaster faded from daily conversation, but it never disappeared from the city's soul. The skyline had changed, new generations had grown up under the hum of airplanes, and yet the memory of that morning, September 25, 1978, still lived in the quiet spaces between the sound of departing jets. For those who had seen the fireball, who had smelled the burning metal, who had heard the cries echo through North Park, time had softened nothing. They carried the memory like a shadow that lengthened with age. Children who had lost parents on PSA Flight 182 were now parents themselves, and they brought their own children to the memorial each year, pointing to the bronze plaque where names shimmered under the California sun. Some of the names had faded slightly, worn by time and weather, but the stories behind them remained vivid. Each flower placed at the site told a silent story, of laughter that never returned, of birthdays missed, of lives frozen in that single instant when two planes met in one sky. Every year, on the anniversary, the city came together. Firefighters who had retired long ago stood beside young cadets too young to remember. Airline employees from across the nation arrived quietly, laying wreaths, their uniforms pressed, their faces solemn. The sound of bagpipes filled the air, and for a few minutes, San Diego fell completely silent. Then, at precisely 9:01 a.m., when the collision had occurred, a single bell rang 6 times. The traditional signal of remembrance for fallen souls. For a city known for its sunlight and surf, the moment was always heavy, sacred even. It was as if the whole world paused to remember the fragility of life and the cost of complacency. Because that was what Flight 182 had become. Not just a tragedy, but a teacher. Its voice recorder still played in classrooms, its photographs still studied by investigators, and its legacy still woven into every flight plan filed around the world. In the decades that followed, aviation transformed. The systems born from that tragedy, collision avoidance alerts, ground radar integration, satellite tracking, became the backbone of modern safety. Planes could now see one another through invisible data links, predicting and preventing disasters before human eyes could even register danger. Pilots no longer relied solely on words and assumptions. They had machines to watch the skies with precision that no person could match. Yet for every leap in technology, for every new regulation and system, the lesson from San Diego remained painfully clear. Technology could guide, but humans must still care. Behind every system was a human being. A pilot, a controller, a passenger, each trusting one another to keep that delicate balance between life and catastrophe. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of Flight 182's legacy. It had been born from trust, destroyed by trust, and ultimately redeemed by it. For the investigators who had worked the case, the memories endured well into their final years. Many had gone on to other accidents, other reports, other cities. But none had forgotten San Diego. One retired NTSB agent, interviewed near the end of his life, said softly, "You never forget your first look at that crater. You walk into that street and you realize it's not just metal. It's people. It's stories." He paused, eyes distant. "We thought we were studying airplanes, but what we were really studying was ourselves." His words would later appear engraved at the Flight 182 Memorial Garden, a message to every visitor who came searching for understanding. Because understanding was what the tragedy demanded. It wasn't just about two planes colliding. It was about the consequences of a single overlooked moment, the way small assumptions can gather like clouds until they block out the sun. The story also became a moral compass for future pilots. In flight academies across the world, instructors invoked the San Diego disaster whenever they spoke about vigilance and humility. They would dim the lights, project radar simulations, and play the audio recordings of that calm, confident crew who never realized they were seconds from death. The room would always fall silent as the final words, "We're going down, baby. This is it," played out. Students sat frozen, the lessons sinking in not through fear, but through awe. They learned that even seasoned pilots could falter, that no flight was truly routine, and that every moment in the sky carried the weight of responsibility for countless lives below. For them, Flight 182 was not just a historical event. It was a ghost that whispered through every takeoff checklist, a reminder that every decision mattered, no matter how small. And for the city itself, the ghost became a guardian. North Park thrived again, its rebuilt homes filled with families, its trees taller than before, its streets vibrant with life. Yet the memory lingered. Locals would say that sometimes at sunset, when the sky turned gold and orange above the neighborhood, the light took on an almost otherworldly glow. Pilots flying into San Diego International often remarked on it too, the way the air shimmered softly as they descended toward the coast. Some said it was just the marine haze, others swore it was something else, a quiet acknowledgement from the sky itself that it remembered. On certain anniversaries, pilots flying overhead would dim their cockpit lights for a moment, just a gesture of respect. It became a quiet tradition, one that needed no words. For historians, Flight 182 remained one of aviation's most defining events, a case study that bridged the gap between old and new, between human intuition and technological evolution. It reminded the world that progress often comes at a cost too great to bear, and that every improvement in safety is written with the ink of loss. But for San Diego, the story wasn't about data or procedures, it was about humanity. About how a city rose from the ashes and chose to remember rather than forget. In schools, children were taught about the tragedy not to instill fear, but respect, for flight, for precision, for life itself. And every year, when journalists returned to cover the anniversary, they found the same resilience in the community, the same quiet strength that had carried them through decades of healing. In the end, the story of PSA Flight 182 was not just about what was lost, but about what was learned. The world had built safer skies from its wreckage. Pilots and controllers spoke differently because of it. Families had turned their grief into advocacy, their loss into legacy. And though time had dulled the immediate pain, it had not dimmed the meaning. For as long as planes fly and people look up to watch them pass, there will always be a part of San Diego that whispers to the heavens, "We remember." The camera of memory pans upward now, to a sky so blue it seems endless. Somewhere far above, a passenger jet glides smoothly through the sunlight, its engines humming softly. A sound that once terrified, now comforts. The passengers inside chat quietly, sip coffee, stare out the windows at the clouds below, never realizing that every safe mile they travel is a tribute to those who came before. That every beep of a radar system, every alert that warns of traffic ahead, is a gift bought with the lessons of the past. And as the world moves forward, the story remains. Etched in the air, carried by the wind, remembered by those who look up and know what that silence once meant. The tragedy of San Diego was not just a moment in time. It was a turning point in history. 2 planes, 1 sky, 1 lesson that humanity vowed never to forget. If you found this story moving, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Every story we tell keeps their memory alive. Each one a tribute to courage, loss, and the strength that allows us to keep flying forward. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may your skies be clear, your flight safe, and your heart forever open to the lessons written in the clouds.